Okay, here's something to think about. What if a key crossroads in human genetic history, well, what if it isn't where you might expect, like, say, Europe or Asia? What if it's actually in a place that's often overlooked, Guinea, right there in West Africa? It's a pretty compelling question, isn't it?
It really is, and there's some fascinating science behind it. Researchers have found that Guinea's gene pool carries some of the most ancient mitochondrial DNA lineages on Earth.
Mitochondrial DNA, right? That's the
Right.
lineage passed down directly from mother to child. Super important for tracing deep history.
Exactly. It's invaluable for that. We're talking specifically about the L0, L1, and L2 haplogroups. You can think of them as sort of the foundational branches, the mother branches of essentially all human mitochondrial DNA.
Wow. That really drives home the power of genetics, doesn't it? These aren't just codes. They're like genetic time capsules, whispering stories from, what, over 60,000 years ago?
That's the time frame we're looking at, yes.
Yeah.
Incredible echoes from the past.
So, for this deep dive, our mission really is to explore why Guinea's genetic story is so unique and how it maybe challenges our usual understanding of human migration, identity, and what it all means for, well, our collective past and maybe even our future. So, get ready because we're going to uncover some genuinely unexpected findings and some pretty powerful perspectives. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. How exactly did Guinea end up being such a unique genetic hotspot? You mentioned it being a living archive. How did that happen?
Well, a huge part of it comes down to geography. Guinea's position is quite distinct. It's right there at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean and the African rainforest.
Okay.
And researchers believe this region served as a really crucial refuge during severe climate shifts way back in prehistoric times.
A refuge, so like a safer place to be when the environment got harsh.
Exactly. And this unique environment meant that populations there remained genetically isolated for much longer periods than maybe happen elsewhere.
Ah, isolation. So that's
Mhm.
the key.
It seems to be a major factor, yes. It allowed for the preservation of these ancient DNA patterns that were diluted or simply lost in other regions that saw more population mixing over time.
So it's almost like Guinea became the sort of genetic vault, holding on to these older lineages, partly because of that geographic isolation.
That's a good way to put it. This distinct history makes Guinea genetically different, even from its immediate neighbors like Senegal or Sierra Leone. It effectively created this living archive of early West African ancestry. It's really a unique natural laboratory.
Okay, building on that ancient history, how does this connect to more recent human movements? I'm thinking specifically about the transatlantic slave trade. Many African Americans, for instance, trace some of their DNA back towards that region, right? Towards Guinea.
That's correct, yes. Genetic studies have shown connections, but pinpointing an exact national lineage gets really complicated.
Why is that?
Well, mainly because the colonial era borders, the ones that define modern Guinea, were often drawn arbitrarily. They didn't necessarily align with the pre-existing ethnic groups and their territories.
Right, borders imposed from outside.
Exactly. But studies, like some published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, have estimated that maybe up to 13% of African Americans carry ancestry tied to ethnic groups found within modern-day Guinea, groups like the Fulani or the Mandinka. And often, people carrying this DNA might not even be aware of that specific connection.
That's really interesting. But what about the popular ancestry kits people use today? How do they handle this complexity? Does it cause issues?
That's actually a really critical point, and yeah, it can be problematic. Often these commercial kits tend to generalize. They might lump Guinea-specific genetic contributions under broader categories like just West African or sometimes even broadly sub-Saharan.
Ah, so it kind of smooths over the details.
It can, yes. And that can lead to misclassification, or at least a lack of specificity, which, raises important questions about representation and identity in commercial genomics, especially for individuals who are really seeking those precise links back to their heritage. It can be a source of frustration, definitely.
I see. Beyond these, let's say, historical connections and identity questions, Guinea's genetic story also tells us about survival, right? About adaptation. What about those unique immunity traits found in the population there?
Yes, that's another fascinating layer. Studies have highlighted genetic adaptations to malaria, which has historically been a huge selective pressure in the region. Specifically, there's a high frequency of something called the Duffy-null allele. It's a genetic variant.
Duffy-null. And what does that do?
It confers resistance to one specific type of malaria parasite, Plasmodium vivax. And this variant is incredibly common across West Africa, present in over 95% of the population. But it seems to be found in particularly high concentrations within Guinea itself.
Wow, over 95%. That's a powerful natural defense against that type of malaria. But is it all upside? Are there any trade-offs?
Well, this is where it gets really complex and it touches on bioethics. That same genetic mutation, the Duffy-null allele, while protective against Plasmodium vivax, it might also be linked to other things like potentially increased inflammation risks or maybe lower white blood cell counts in some contexts.
Ah, okay. So it's not just a simple good gene.
Exactly. It's not just a scientific curiosity. It's a really profound reminder that what evolution selects as beneficial is highly context dependent. It depends on the environment, the threats. It forces us to move beyond simplistic ideas of genetic advantage versus disadvantage, especially when we think about long-term health. It really makes you ask, how do we define beneficial when we're looking at genetics shaped over centuries of survival against specific threats?
That's a really important nuance. Okay, zooming out again. When we look at the bigger picture of Guinea's genetics, what does it tell us about ancient Africa overall? I think you mentioned earlier there were some discoveries that really challenge older assumptions.
Yes, absolutely. And this is perhaps one of the most surprising aspects. Certain subgroups within Guinea researchers point to groups like the Tukulur and maybe some Moorish populations show genetic markers that they share with North African Berber populations, and even with ancient Sahelian nomads.
Wait, North African markers in Guinea? That seems unexpected, given the Sahara Desert is in between.
It is unexpected based on older models. It definitely goes against the simpler assumptions about purely sub-Saharan migratory patterns or strict
Yeah.
isolation between North and West Africa in deep prehistory.
So how do scientists explain these connections? What are the theories?
Well, there are a couple of main hypotheses being debated. One idea is that there were waves of ancient back migration from North Africa or the Sahel southward long, long before the later Arab or Islamic expansions that we know more about historically.
Okay, ancient movements.
The other possibility involves extensive prehistoric trade networks and intermarriage routes that could have fostered these genetic connections across really vast distances, even across geographical barriers like the Sahara.
So either way, it suggests much more ancient connection and movement than we might have assumed.
Precisely. It fundamentally challenges the idea that Guinea's genetic heritage is purely sub-Saharan or developed in total isolation. It really opens the door to these fascinating archaeogenetic debates. That's where archaeology and genetics combine forces. Debates about whether ancient Africa was far more interconnected, more dynamic than maybe our previous models allowed for.
It paints a much more complex picture. But this kind of research, digging into genetics and origins, especially in a place with a history like Guinea's, it must raise some sensitive issues, right? Cultural, ethical tensions.
Absolutely. That's a crucial dimension to all of this. You have to remember Guinea's colonial history as French Guinea. That period, unfortunately, led to the disruption and sometimes the outright erasure of indigenous tribal records and histories.
Right, the colonial impact.
So often, genetic research today has to rely heavily on oral traditions, on community memory, and on post-colonial reconstructions to try and piece together the historical context for the genetic findings.
Which must lead to friction sometimes.
It can, yes. It creates a potential and sometimes very real cultural tension. The core of it often boils down to who really gets to define ethnic identity? Is it the genetic markers identified by science? Or is it the community's own understanding, their oral history, their lived experience?
That's a really profound question. It pushes us to think about what constitutes truth or history. Do, ancestry test results, for instance, carry more weight than a tribal lineage that's been passed down orally for generations? Where's the balance?
Exactly. It forces a consideration of the limits and maybe even the biases within both scientific data and historical records or oral traditions. It highlights how scientific findings interact with these deeply rooted cultural narratives. It really necessitates a dialogue, a collaboration, not just a top-down scientific declaration. It's crucial for a respectful and ultimately a more complete understanding.
So if we try to bring all these threads together, Guinea's gene pool, it's clearly so much more than just, a collection of scientific data points. It feels like it's a cultural map, a story of incredible survival against disease and climate change, and also a vital, if complex, bridge connecting histories across the Atlantic.
Absolutely. This deep dive really touches on these huge themes: identity, diaspora, adaptation, the responsibility of science. And if we try to connect it to the bigger picture, I think it becomes clear that while genetics gives us this incredible blueprint of our past, it shows migration, it shows adaptation. It's really the rich tapestry of culture, of resilience, of memory, shared memory, that ultimately writes our legacy, that defines who we are moving forward.
That's a powerful way to frame it. Genetics offers the roots, maybe, but culture, resilience, memory. That's how the story continues. It really underscores the multifaceted nature of identity, doesn't it? And how these ongoing discoveries are constantly reshaping how we understand our shared human history. There's always more to learn, isn't there? More connections to uncover, more stories waiting in our DNA and in our communities. Makes you think,